Welcome to my channel, where every song lyric, every movie scene, and every book page reveals its secrets. The vast majority of educated people have at least heard of George Orwell's immortal novel 1984, are familiar with its plot, and hopefully, many have left their marks on its pages while reading and attempting to analyze its meaning, searching for its central message. In preparation for writing this review, I read 1984 for the third time. Usually, increasing experience in reading literature takes its toll, often not in favor of a book to which one returns. However, with Orwell's dystopia, the situation is quite the opposite. A repeated journey into the world he created, with the perspective of passing time, offers an even deeper experience when analyzing 1984. It has already become a mark of sophistication to reference 1984. Like Animal Farm, the book has been taken apart for quotes and spread across countless social media platforms, where on a user's profile, they are presumably meant to hint at a deep inner world, exceptional critical thinking skills, and a profound ability to analyze 1984. It's hard not to call 1984 one of the most atmospheric books in modern literature. The 5 or 6 hours spent alongside the protagonist, Winston, feel like an immersion into an alternate reality, one that existed not only in George Orwell's mind. Something exists as long as we believe in it. This paraphrase of a well-known saying applies to the entire dystopian genre. Can you, sitting in a warm and cozy room, well-fed and free, detach yourself from these comforts and imagine yourself in the shoes of a citizen under the despotic rule of Ingsoc? Of course, the well-known benefit of reading, engaging the imagination to create an entirely new reality, works differently for everyone. One person's vision of Orwell's dystopian world will be shaped by personal experiences, while another might draw from news, films, or other literature. The thing is, the author does not rely on traditional descriptive tools to build his world. Even after 300 pages of 1984 in Winston's perspective, it's unlikely that you'll have a complete and vivid image of what London and Oceania looks like or how it differs from the one we know. Orwell immerses us in his universe not through detailed visual descriptions, but through the portrayal of society and the life of an individual. Instead of architectural precision in depicting buildings or interiors, we see Winston's subjective perception, filtered through the lens of his strange, by our standards, life experience. This is not a case of laziness or a lack of effort on the author's part, but a deliberate creative blueprint that we, as readers, are free to fill in as best we can, guided, of course, by Orwell's direction. 1984, an analysis of which can be just as fascinating as reading it, offers us a vast artistic and spatial reality to explore. One of the 3 key ideological pillars of the party in Oceania, the totalitarian state of 1984, is the society of Ingsoc, where our protagonist, Winston, resides. We can strain ourselves trying to prove that we are something greater, but in reality, we are often guided by the same primal instincts as other species. The society of Ingsoc in 1984 exists in a state of constant war, not so much in a physical sense, but psychologically. The principle of permanent war is driven by resource acquisition and ideological opposition to an abstract external enemy. The power of any strong state, unfortunately, rests on military force, and we can clearly see this today. George Orwell wrote his novel under the shadow of World War II and the emerging Cold War between the newly formed superpowers. 70 years later, despite significant progress, we still live in a world governed by the same primal laws, a reality that becomes evident when analyzing 1984. War is peace. On the surface, war is about demonstrating strength, seizing resources, imposing one's ideology, and suppressing opposing views. However, Orwell exposes a less obvious motive, one rarely discussed openly. The main idea of 1984, as I see it, is war for the sake of war. The author reduces the grandiose rhetoric of geopolitical conflicts between Oceania, East Asia, and Eurasia to absurdity. These nations wage war, not for tangible reasons, but because the war itself must be endless. In any war, the greatest suffering falls upon the weakest members of society, those who are not encouraged to think critically, question authority, or analyze events. Consider the 2 world wars of the 20th century. From the standpoint of a ruling elite, it would be disastrous to allow soldiers to make their own moral judgments, to differentiate between worse and less bad enemies. Orwell presents this grim reality in 1984 through a strikingly unconventional perspective. The essence of war is not only the destruction of human lives, but also the eradication of the fruits of human labor. War is a means of shattering, dispersing into the stratosphere, and sinking into the depths of the sea materials that could have improved people's lives, and ultimately made them more intelligent. Even when weapons are not destroyed on the battlefield, their production serves as a convenient way to consume human effort without creating anything for actual use. The world of 1984 is divided into three superstates and a so-called buffer zone between them. According to the party, Oceania, Eastasia, and Eurasia have always been at war. This war was, is, and will be as inevitable as the rising and setting of the sun. At any given moment, the party informs the public that one of these enemies has become an ally, yet this revelation carries no real weight. The identity of the enemy may change, but the fact of having an enemy remains constant. This concept reaches its peak in the second half of 1984, during Winston's time in one of the city's squares. When the government announces a sudden peace agreement with one of the former enemies, the posters plastered across buildings no longer reflect the updated truth. As a result, they are immediately labeled as the work of saboteurs. The people of Oceania erupt into blind, animalistic rage, reinforcing the fact that their collective consciousness never ceases to burn with hostility. In Orwell's world, millions of citizens are kept in a state of constant anxiety and dissatisfaction until a new enemy is presented to them. But the war never truly ends. Thus, after yet another change of enemy, the employees of the Ministry of Truth worked almost non-stop for an entire week. Once their work was complete, not a single person in the world could prove, through documentation, that the war with Eurasia had ever existed. In reality, the party and Big Brother are not waging war against an external enemy, but against their own people. Another central theme of 1984 is the deliberate destruction of surplus production. Orwell expands on the idea that the party systematically eliminates excess goods to prevent prosperity. Why allow the masses to live in comfort and security when an extra pair of shoes or a razor blade can simply never be produced? Instead, vast quantities of resources are wasted on perpetual war. Imagine how much collective good could be achieved if the military budgets of Oceania, Eurasia, and Eastasia were redirected toward fighting diseases, improving education, or developing sustainable energy technologies. A particularly striking example of Orwell's insight into mass control is the party's infamous 2 minutes hate. The citizens of Oceania, already subjected to relentless propaganda, are routinely whipped into a frenzy by images of a fabricated enemy. Whether it's marching soldiers with mongoloid features, implying an imminent invasion, or the face of a notorious traitor like Emmanuel Goldstein, the message remains the same. The enemy is everywhere. It does not even matter if Goldstein is real or merely a creation of the party. He is a Judas, a betrayer of Ingsoc, Big Brother, and every citizen of Oceania. His very existence, whether factual or fabricated, serves as a rallying point for the collective hatred of the masses. Orwell masterfully portrays how a regime maintains its grip on power, not by defending against external threats, but by manufacturing them. In 1984, war is not a means to an end. War is the end. Another assertion of the ruling party in Oceania appears contradictory, at least to us. But for a generation raised in an atmosphere of hatred from an early age, where one unquestioningly accepts whatever is declared to be true, this is the very essence of reality. As a child, Winston, the novel's protagonist, now nearing 40, first lost his father and later his mother. In the latter case, he does not even know whether she was executed or remains imprisoned in some labor camp. Here, Orwell unmistakably alludes to infamous totalitarian regimes such as Nazi Germany and Stalinist USSR, which established entire death factories for their own citizens by isolating so-called undesirable elements. Every inhabitant of London and Oceania in 1984 lives in a constant state of fear and anxiety, fully aware that a careless gesture or a single misplaced word could cost them not only their freedom, but likely their lives. This is a fundamental component of any oppressive system of mass control, denying people their ability to fulfill the basic human need for security and a sense of autonomy. The dystopian society of 1984 is exposed through its relentless suppression of these fundamental necessities. Once wealth becomes universal, it ceases to create distinctions. One could, of course, imagine a society where material goods, personal property, and pleasures are evenly distributed, while power remains concentrated in the hands of a small privileged caste. However, in practice, such a society cannot remain stable for long. If security and leisure become accessible to all, the vast masses, dulled by poverty, would become educated and learn to think for themselves. Eventually, they would realize that the privileged minority serves no real function and would inevitably overthrow it. Ultimately, a hierarchical society can only be sustained through poverty and ignorance. As a member of the so-called outer party of Ingsoc, Winston is under constant surveillance day and night. There are cameras in his home, at work, and on the streets. This is why the scenes of his meetings with Julia are particularly remarkable. Despite her own admission of being morally corrupt, in 1984, Julia symbolizes the fragile opportunity to simply be alone with someone or with one's own thoughts, outside of total control. In a totalitarian society, such moments are unfortunately a rarity. They exchange brief words even on busy streets, always in a crowd of Ingsoc members to avoid drawing attention. Their sexual relationship itself is an act of defiance, something the party and Big Brother have yet to take away from them. In the society of Oceania, where love and intimacy are discouraged, except for the necessary procreation of new citizens, they indulge in their desires under the green tree in the meadow, albeit with constant caution. In one scene, in a grimy hotel room, Winston emphasizes how wonderful it is to simply sit and read a book without being watched. The author seems to address the reader directly, highlighting the privilege of reading a book, analyzing 1984, and in my case, even reviewing it for others. One of the key themes in 1984, in the context of establishing a totalitarian regime, is generational continuity. With each new generation, the possibility of a public uprising diminishes. Children are taught not only the core principles of Ingsoc, but also encouraged to spy and report. The young generation of Oceania grows up as loyal followers of the party from an early age and is ready to turn in their own parents. Winston is familiar with cases where children have sent their own parents to death or labor camps. For the party's despotic regime, this is the ideal outcome: devoted sons and daughters of Big Brother. Freedom is slavery. At the same time, George Orwell allows for a certain degree of human agency in the form of the so-called proles. These are the proletariat, the working class, making up 85% of Oceania's population. Winston sees in them a hope for the future and a possible escape from totalitarian rule. Their lives are barely monitored, unlike party members. They are not forbidden from engaging in pre-revolutionary behaviors, and even prostitution flourishes among them. Many of the proles are elderly people who remember a different time. However, a symbolic scene in a bar illustrates a significant problem. Winston tries to extract meaningful insight from an old man but fails. They seem to speak different languages, and no substantive conversation takes place. Orwell presents the working class as the brute force of any revolution. But according to inter-party member O'Brien, the new regime has learned from history and will eventually eradicate any possibility of power change in Oceania. And how can one discuss totalitarianism in 1984 without mentioning the emblematic figure of Big Brother, the leader of the Ingsoc Revolution, who remains steadfast in his commitment to the ideals and needs of society? A stern-faced man with a mustache, resembling both Hitler and Stalin. A striking illustration of the kind of dictator the 20th century saw many of. As with the party's primary enemy, Goldstein, it is unknown whether Big Brother actually exists. No one among the hundreds of millions in Oceania has ever seen him in person. He does not age, he does not change, he does not deliver speeches. His image embodies the entire social order of Ingsoc, tirelessly watching everyone. From posters and telescreens across Oceania, his piercing gaze follows every citizen. Orwell's 1984 has made Big Brother a household name, synonymous with totalitarianism, the loss of personal freedoms, and the abuse of surveillance and police powers. Despite Winston's legitimate questions, he never discovers the truth, because truth is whatever we believe in, or rather, whatever we are made to believe in. Perhaps the most frequently discussed aspect of Ingsoc's policy in relation to George Orwell's 1984 is the concept of doublethink. The citizens of Oceania are trained from childhood to think exactly as the party desires, to accept any information given to them, and to declare black as white and vice versa if necessary. When critical thinking, analysis, factual history, and original truths are practically eradicated, meaning itself is lost. It becomes impossible to even speak of truth distortion because truth becomes whatever it is made to be. In this regard, the reader of 1984 has a unique advantage: the ability to evaluate the text from a world outside such despotism. This theme is vividly manifested in the infamous Room 101, where Winston finds himself at a certain point. Under relentless torture, his deepest fears, and the total suppression of his will, he is forced to reject even the most obvious truths if required. Ultimately, if the party and Big Brother claim, and torture reinforces, that 2 plus 2 is not 4 but 5, then so it is. Ignorance is strength. Day by day, almost minute by minute, the past was adjusted to fit the present. As a result, documents could be used to confirm the accuracy of any party prediction. Not a single piece of news or opinion that contradicted the needs of the moment existed in the records. History, like an old parchment, was scraped clean and rewritten, again and again, as often as necessary. And there was no way to prove the forgery afterward. In the Society of Oceania, apparently in all major cities besides London, Airstrip 1, there exist so-called ministries responsible for ensuring the party's chosen course is followed. In reality, these are totalitarian institutions that distort reality and ruthlessly punish those who, even if only in their own minds, refuse to accept the established order. Orwell, in 1984, employs irony even in the very names of these organizations. The Ministry of Plenty regularly feeds hundreds of millions of people exaggerated or outright distorted information about the level of public prosperity. Monthly and yearly production plans for various goods are always reported as being overfulfilled in Oceania. According to the ministry, more shoes are supposedly manufactured than there are people in the state, yet somehow, half of the populace walks around half barefoot in tattered rags. The furnace of war constantly consumes natural resources and goods themselves. One thing is certain: every quarter, astronomical amounts of footwear are produced on paper, while in reality, half of Oceania's population remains barefoot. The Ministry of Love, instead of fostering relationships within Oceania's society or deterring people from crime, has elevated so-called crimes to the level of mere thoughts and actions deemed incorrect by the party's doctrine. Consider a satellite organization with a name that sounds provocative to us: the Junior Anti-Sex League, where the youth of 1984 are indoctrinated with the idea that any feelings toward the opposite sex are meaningless, that attachment is dangerous, and that love is even more so. As an inter-party member reveals, the conception of children will soon be reduced entirely to artificial insemination, further suppressing this ancient instinct. After all, the very concept of love requires a degree of external comfort, something the people of Oceania are systematically deprived of through constant surveillance, intimidation, and repression. The Ministry of Peace, as one might easily guess, is responsible for matters of perpetual war and for instilling this state of conflict in the minds of Oceania's citizens. Since we cannot trust the authenticity of Goldstein's book, at least according to O'Brien, it remains unknown whether the war is even still ongoing. Taken to its logical extreme, any given citizen might not even know what exists beyond their own city, whether the other two superstates still stand, or if they have already been reduced to nuclear ashes. Orwell places significant emphasis on the fear of aerial bombings targeting civilians, an unmistakable literary nod to the bombing raids of World War II, particularly those on London. While reading 1984, one repeatedly wonders whether, in such a totalitarian society, where reality is constantly reshaped, there might be deliberate fearmongering aimed at the nation's own people. If battles rage in distant lands, they may fail to keep the population sufficiently agitated, whereas the periodic deaths of dozens of children or elderly citizens from a bombing strike serve as a far more compelling argument. The Ministry of Truth is perhaps the most fascinating institution and one of the central motifs of Orwell's 1984. Long before the advent of the internet and unrestricted access to alternative sources of information, public opinion was shaped by newspapers, radio, and later, television. The so-called information front was gaining momentum throughout the 20th century and had already made its mark during World War II by the time Orwell wrote his novel. Most of the details about the inner workings of this ministry come from the protagonist, Winston. His job is to falsify history and alter known information. Like hundreds of other insignificant workers, he sits in a cramped cubicle, modifying old news articles or passages from books to align with the party's latest directives. Reality is continuously being rewritten. Once all old copies of newspapers are destroyed and reprinted with the revised versions, even the most well-informed members of the party in Oceania will have no way to reconstruct the original truths. Historical forgery and manipulation. There is no way to prove anything because no evidence remains. The party invented the airplane, and Big Brother's predictions always come true. Falsification of facts is one of the key pillars of propaganda and a totalitarian society, where the subjective right to truth becomes the exclusive privilege of the state. Orwell vividly illustrates in 1984 how any achievements, failures, or records can be erased or rewritten. How, yet again, black can be turned into white and vice versa. Ultimately, the most tragic aspect of this practice is the irreversible loss of true history, stripping it of any meaning. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more exciting discoveries.